Good afternoon. I'm Sherri Goodman from the Wilson Center, joined by Peter Davies, also of the Wilson Center. We're very pleased to have with us this afternoon both Shannon Jenkins and Phil Thorne from the United States Coast Guard. Gentlemen, you participated with us this afternoon in a demonstration scenario on a nuclear shipping incident in the Bering Strait. What are your key takeaways from this demonstration?
So first, a lot of it's the intangible. So right after our panel, I had at least 4 different people come up to me and start asking me questions and making connections, connected some with Phil, and I'm connecting them with some other entities within the Coast Guard. So I don't think that gets captured a lot of times. It's just the intangibles from being able to participate in something like this. So thank you very much for including us on the panel first off. So that helps us make the connections and have the conversations with people beyond just the panel itself. The panel itself I thought was really good. It was a lot of interchange, a lot of good dialogue there. And I know that it's an hour and a half, and that seemed like it flew by. The connections and the kind of the back and forth. I think you noticed a lot of the panelists talking about, well, to build on what Austin said or to build on what Becca said. So there was a lot of that interchange back and forth. And it helps us kind of as a federal group that was up on the panel, as well as the Austin and Gail from the indigenous side as well, kind of build some of that back and forth, but I think that also helps the audience understand how this back and forth has to happen in something like this. It's not just the government, not just the federal government, not just the local government, the state government, the Alaska Natives. It has to be an integrated issue when we have an incident in the Arctic. And like I said, it's when I think Phil talked about it, saying that a nuclear incident in the Arctic is going to be a national incident. Well, like I said, any incident in the Arctic is going to be a national incident. So having some of these conversations, getting the dialogue started, I think is extremely helpful.
So I also I wanted to thank you for being able to participate in the tabletop. I thought it was a useful format and also very effective. I was able to offer my view from the perspective of the regional Coast Guard commander and sort of the operational response, but I learned a lot at the table. It was clearly only one important point of view of an incident like that. There are certainly environmental components and international components that are critical to solving what is a really challenging scenario. So I learned a lot, and I think that you invited the right people to the table to talk about it. So I thought it was a very productive 90 minutes, well spent.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I have a question from Shannon. I know that you spent some pretty intense time on Deepwater Horizon.
Yes.
And the question I have for you is, I'm sure there were a myriad of lessons learned in real time and in retrospect afterwards. And I'm wondering what comes to mind first to you that says, I remember that on Deepwater, and we're likely to see something similar in this one. So what comes to the surface for you on this Bering Strait nuclear shipping incident?
I'll give you a little story to help illustrate that. When Deepwater Horizon happened, we had people coming out of the woodworks, literally and figuratively, with the good ideas, the good idea fairies. So that was overwhelming our responders down on scene. So as part of what we did for the National Incident Command, we established this interagency solutions group where it was that collective of all the federal stakeholders involved in the spill. We were all in one room. We could quickly, look across the table and talk to each other and solve issues and do them collaboratively. One of the ideas was they wanted to build these berms to prevent any oil from coming into the estuaries, from coming up, floating up from the bottom. So they asked us to take a look at it. We looked at it. We went back to our scientific experts within our own groups, and we came back and said, not a good idea. It was very costly, and predominantly the issue was the water moving in and out, the tidal flow flushes out those estuaries, and without that, then there's no oxygen, everything and all the wildlife, all the fish, marine species would die essentially from lack of oxygen. So we submitted our findings back up through the chain, and a few days later, we said, nope, we want you guys to take another look at this. So we took a little more in-depth look. We provided some additional facts supporting our original findings, submitted that out. A few days later, they came back and said, no, we really want you to take a look at this. So again, we went back and we got some really detailed answers from our scientific community to help support and really defend what we were saying, that this was not a good idea, that it was going to do more harm than good. If they'd approached us individually from the agency perspective, I don't know that we would have been able to defend that decision without having that collective there. And also without having that scientific backing that we had. It wasn't just us pulling information out of the air. We had the scientific community take a look at this and give us the explanation of why this would not work, the pros and cons. Without having that collective instead of that isolated pocket perspective, I don't know that we would have been successful in defending that, because it was more of a political issue, political decision, than it was a scientific discussion on it. So I think the same thing is going to happen whenever you have an incident, but in the Arctic, I think having that collective, working on issues jointly, will help us make the right decisions. The added piece to that puzzle in the Arctic is going to be that in Alaska Native, the indigenous perspective on it, to help us understand the nuances associated from their issues, their perspectives with it. Obviously, we don't have the Alaska Native communities down in Deepwater Horizon, so they were not part of that construct there. And I don't know that we've built in that construct for something in Alaska yet. I'll have to refer to Phil to that, or what the contingency plans are, but I think that's an important portion of it. It's that federal level, it's the state level, it's the local level, it's the Alaska Native level, it's the scientific community level. All of that has a role in understanding what we need to do when we need to do it.
Phil, how can we use a scenario exercise to help build capacity across scientific, indigenous, and operational communities to better prepare to respond to a future incident in the Arctic?
I think that being able to exercise scenarios and exercise responses to scenarios like that, the Coast Guard, and I know other agencies, follow a process in their exercises which documents lessons learned. And they can be very specific to document lessons learned and action items that need to occur after the exercise. The exercise provides a vehicle for identifying shortfalls very specifically and helps quantify those shortfalls, which empowers the agencies to turn around and address those shortfalls, and the interagency to do as well. So I think large-scale exercises and tabletops provide that role to identify shortfalls that perhaps if it were people just having a conversation or having a meeting about it, those lessons wouldn't be as sharp.
And in this particular case where we're looking broader than just the operational community, but including the scientific community, the reach back to the indigenous community, can those mechanisms of lessons learned and identifying shortfalls be applied in this case as well?
I certainly think so. I think if we were to, as you described, do a fuller, longer tabletop exercise, which we've conducted in Alaska in the past. The truth is, as I discussed at during our 90-minute session, was the Coast Guard and the interagency's answer to those scenarios and those incidents is to form a unified command, to bring a large number of people with authorities and resources to the table to respond. All of the appropriate people do come to the response. And those incidents are complex. There is not one agency that can even lead a response. My experience with them as they evolve over time, and a lead agency at the beginning can actually take a more support role as it goes on. They evolve over time, and by exercising them over the appropriate period of time, you can get at a lot of lessons at a lot of governmental and scientific levels.
And you also build the trust in the relationships that you need when the time comes.
So there's certainly an axiom that says the first time, it is never good that the first time you meet somebody is in the middle of an incident.
And I could build on that a little bit. So that's what's so key about the Arctic Coast Guard Forum too, from that international perspective. Again, is making those connections. Just knowing who to call when something happens is a key piece of it. But working through some of those challenges that we've seen, just being able to communicate with each other, like what frequency, what channels are they operating on versus which channels we operate on. Those types of pieces, like Phil said, you don't want to meet somebody for the first time during an incident. You want to work through those ahead of time. So those have been some keys, I think, progressing in how we're going to connect with that international community when something happens in the Arctic. Not if, but when.
Thank you. On that important note, not if, but when, we conclude.
Thank you.
All right, great, thank you.